the Pope. I'm going to share some of my concerns about the Pope's policies and his visit to the United States, but I also want to share my appreciation for parts of his encyclical entitled Our Common Home. The interconnections between peace and the planet and poverty that he draws, and many of the points that he makes in that encyclical, humanists can embrace fully despite our deep disagreements over certain aspects of Vatican policy. Now, when I was a little boy, peace, poverty, and the planet all kind of fused together, because I grew up in the 60s when the war on poverty was going on, and the anti-war movement started, and the first Earth Day in 1970, I remember. So all of these issues coalesced in my little adolescent brain to basically give me one message, and that was, you can make a better world. So I grew up with this, but looking around today, I see that there are 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world. The atmosphere is filling up with CO2. The planet's warming, the ice caps are melting, and the seas are rising. And the rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. So where is that idealism now? Well, the Pope is very idealistic and has inspired idealism in many people because of his position on peace and the planet and poverty. I know there are widely ranging opinions in this society, in this neighborhood, about the Pope's visit. The Ethical Society is, and our extended network of friends and neighbors on Rittenhouse Square here are a very diverse community. Some are idealistic activists, interfaith involved, and thrilled at the visit of the first progressive Pope in a long time. Others are staunch secularists, angry at the fact that we're shelling out a lot of tax dollars to pay for his visit. Some of us will be inconvenienced. Others of us will be much more than inconvenienced. Some will lose days of hourly salary, not be able to get to their doctor's office, or have a chance to go to their place of worship because of this visit and the security measures. So this is a difficult issue to touch on. It is made a little easier by the fact that that encyclical is actually a pretty amazing document. How many have read it? How many have read all of it? Okay, thank you. It's a long piece, let me tell you. So I'm not going to touch on all the aspects of different opinions. I cannot do that. So excuse me for exploring my own challenge regarding the Pope's, his visit, and his policies. And it's an inner struggle between my desire to balance criticism of the regressive elements of the Catholic Church with my enthusiasm for the progressive aspects of what Pope Francis is bringing. In particular, I'm intrigued by that encyclical, Our Common Home. Now, in it, the Pope emphasizes the fundamental interrelatedness of nature and all of society. He talks about the fact that war and greed and exploitation feed off of each other. And it awakens in me that naive idealism I had when I was a kid. And it's one reason why I'm working in interfaith efforts more and more, like with Power, our collaborators in this city, to try to work for social justice, wage justice, education, and so on. It's a reason why I'm working with an interfaith team to offer a program this afternoon from 2 to 4:30 involving Peace Day celebration and dialogue. Now, Felix Adler, the founder of the ethical humanist movement, fueled his activism by working in interfaith environments. He worked with people with very different religious views than his. His religion with Catholicism is complicated. He saw it as both good and bad. In his platform address of February 23rd, 1880, entitled, ready for this? How Rome Should Be Fought, he attacked as irrational basing social policy on revelation. I'm fine with that. He viciously critiqued the Vatican's attempt to, what he claimed, control parts of our educational system by establishing parochial schools and seeking public funding for those schools. Sounds familiar. This was all what he said was part of the battle, to quote, against the menacing power of Rome. Now, anybody who knows the history of anti-Catholicism in this country knows that during the 1800s there was vicious attacks of Catholics in this country. Anybody who knows the history of the Know Nothing Party, there were riots, Catholics were abused and beat up and ostracized from businesses. So some of the words that Adler uses I feel a little uncomfortable with, but I get some of his broader points about policies. And Adler also praised greatly the charity over the ages of the Catholic Church. He talks about the earnest missionaries bringing education and empowerment and food and clothing to the disempowered people around the globe. And he talks about the fact that many people who have been turned off by the church back then because of its extremism and its wealth and all the gilded cathedrals and so on, are won back by the good works of many of the Catholics involved. He said, despite his disagreements, quote, a religion capable, this is what he said people said who came back to the church. They thought, quote, a religion capable of inspiring such deeds cannot be an unsafe religion to live by or an unsafe religion to die by. That's an interesting admission, that the good work they did was powerful. And he thought that Catholicism would continue to flourish until some other force, maybe ethical humanism, quote, this is what he said, can show at least equal devotion and equal self-sacrifice in its followers. An ethical religion that, quote, will satisfy the deep need for the human heart for heroism and magnanimous action. A religion that will lift man above the fetter of the trivial and kindle anew the souls of old and young with flaming enthusiasm. I want flaming enthusiasm. Give me some of that. So I wonder in my mind if the enthusiasm that the Pope is bringing is going to catch hold and push a conservative Catholic bureaucracy towards change. Will it touch the hearts of the 1.2 billion Catholics in the world enough to get the Vatican to move from hierarchy towards progressivism? Will it bring peace to the planet? I offer this talk here today because tomorrow is the UN International Day of Peace, and the encyclical rightly does some wonderful connections between environmentalism and social justice and peace. Now, before I speak about what was inspiring to me in the encyclopedia, I want to share some concerns that I have, some ambivalence. I can take some solace in the fact that one of my heroes, Naomi Klein, one of the greatest critics of global capitalism and one of the board members of 350.org, also felt ambivalent when she was invited to Rome to the Vatican for a conference on climate change. Given her very radical reputation as a, quote, secular Jewish feminist, which she self-identified with but then heard it being talked back at her, Klein said she was, quote, convinced the invitation would be rescinded, like when they found out who she really was. In her role as a secular ambassador to the Vatican, she felt that the Pope's bold words about climate change and social justice were important while, quote, disagreeing with him about a whole lot of us. That's what she said. So she had to, what she called it, embrace the contradiction in an effort to make the world a better place. She said that if Pope Francis could possibly manage to change the Vatican, then in her words, quote, we might just stand a chance of tackling climate change. So she's working with this ambivalence. Now, personally, my two biggest concerns are this. The first is this going to be all talk and no action? Because words are easy. I mean, popes have spoken out about things for a long time. Pope John the 23rd, in his 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, he rejected war, but war still continued. John Paul II acted the environmentalist, criticizing, quote, those who see no other meaning in their natural environment than what serves for immediate use and consumption, but we all kept consuming and using. Pope Benedict XVI condemned the structural causes of the dysfunctions of the world's economy that made it impossible for us to protect our environment. They all said these things, but again, do words lead to action? Does Pope Francis's encyclical lead to action? Well, Newsworks reported, at least this, that the Catholic universities and parishes around the country are using the Pope's encyclical in their work now, in their courses of study. In fact, his specific comments that some conservatives criticize, saying he's not an engineer and environmentalist, he shouldn't be saying these things. The Archdiocese of Chicago have actually been having conversations with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, about their building use, their water consumption, and their greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe words can lead to some action. Maybe they filter up through social consciousness and end up changing policy. So that was my hope when I heard the Pope talking about criminal justice reform. He called for an end to solitary confinement, the death penalty, and life imprisonment. And as someone committed to criminal justice reform, I was glad to see that he washed the feet of 12 inmates in a prison in Rome. This week he plans to visit the Cure and Fromhold Correctional Facility up in North Philly. Could this lead to more reform of our prison industrial complex, as as I call it. I hope so. Here at the Ethical Humanist Society, we've been long supporting Art for Justice, and I'm with Anne-Marie Kirk trying to leverage the Pope's visit to get the word out more about this group and the efforts that they're trying to do to humanize our criminal justice reform efforts. We had a big conference here last fall, and I'm continuing to try to leverage this. For those of you who don't know, Art for Justice is an organization that encourages artists from Graterford and Green State prisons who say that they are wrongly convicted or guilty seeking redemption, get the word out about their situation. Artists like Charles Lawson, Danny Gwynn, asking us all to be part of a public dialogue on as a way to prevent crime better, which our system does not do now, and reduce levels of incarceration and find effective, humane ways to treat people who are incarcerated. Danny Gwynn's painting is right by the original is right by the front door as you go out. Now, the Pope's statements on criminal justice reform, his words about that, does make the chance for us to advocate further on this. So Anne-Marie's having an art show at St. Vincent de Paul Church. She can tell you about afterwards. I urge you to go there. Art for Justice is reaching Catholics and more people because of this visit. And if you want to support the effort, I urge you to go to the show, talk about it, see me if you'd like to buy a commemorative poster of the Pope's visit and some of the works by some of the inmate artists there for $20 just to offset costs. This is a very expensive and difficult campaign. So maybe, if you're interested, see me, and maybe this talk will lead to some action. Now, a second concern I have, which is the bigger one, is what the Pope is not talking enough about. Will he ever, for example, advocate for marriage equality? I wonder. What about the thousands of people who died from AIDS because church policy blocked the distribution of condoms? Is he saying enough about the children who were abused by priests who were hid inside the bureaucracy? And will he ever come out and say, straightforwardly, women should have the right to control their own bodies? These are huge issues. Naomi Klein wonders just how far the Pope can go to offset a reactionary Catholic hierarchy. She asks if the Pope will, quote, realize his vision of a church that spends less time condemning people over abortion, contraception, and who they marry, and more time fighting the trampled victims of a highly unequal and unjust economic system. When climate change had to fight for airtime with denunciations of gay marriage, it didn't stand a chance. So look at how the policy rolls out and the way the media portrays it. Now, Mary Robinson, the former and first female president of very Catholic Ireland, praised the Pope's encyclical, especially the environmental evidence, but she did say that he didn't speak at all about the role that women had in development and in environmentalism. It's like they didn't exist. So she's criticizing that. Both from the humanitarian and the ecological perspective of all the issues I've mentioned, reproductive freedom, for me, personally, is the most important. It's my greatest concern. In this month's issue of Free Inquiry magazine, Ed Dorr praised the Pope for embracing science and saying Catholics don't have to, quote, breed like rabbits. Still amazed he said that. But in my view, Dorr was correct in saying that the Vatican's, quote, has an irrational, patriarchal, and damaging ban on contraception and abortion. So again, this tension between what you want to support and what you can't. For poor families, especially in parts of Africa, South America, where the Catholic Church is very powerful, the Vatican has blocked access to family planning. And that can lead to increasing of poverty and fuel runaway population growth. The UN estimates that in Africa alone, by 2100, the population will quadruple unless education and access to birth control is offered to women. John Sager, who's the head of Population Connection, says, appreciation of the Pope's stand on climate change must be tempered by a recognition as the head of an institution wholly governed by men. He has yet to recognize that without access to modern contraception, women remain prisoners of medieval ideology. So until he supports sensible approaches to birth control and AIDS prevention, the progressive aspects of this policy, for me, feel incomplete. For now, I'll try to be like Naomi Klein and embrace that contradiction and work with him on the progressive areas that we agree on, while not backing down on the areas which we don't agree on. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time talking about what I found inspiring in the encyclical. So the first word of inspiration that I found was science. Science. He begins the encyclical by saying he will briefly review several aspects of the present ecological crisis with the aim of drawing on the results of the best scientific research available today. I hope our climate deniers and the directors of all the various creationist museums in this country listen to him. I hope Ted Cruz listens to him. He oversees NASA, and he thinks science is some evil conspiracy. He really does. Now, maybe he can learn things from most other Catholics, because a Yale project on climate change communication found that Catholics are actually more open to humanity's role in climate change than any other denomination, which is interesting. They're open to the Pope's words. Humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat the warming, or at least the human causes which produce or aggravate it. It's common sense. Second words of inspiration I found were when he drew from existing religious traditions to promote environmentalism. Now, I'm not traditionally religious, but I still took some solace in that. Because in the second part of the encyclical, he says he considers some, quote, principles drawn from the Judeo-Christian tradition which can render our commitment to the environment more coherent. He points out that science and religion have not always been opposed to each other. And that's been whipped up in the media and by conservative forces. But in fact, there's plenty in the Judeo-Christian religion tradition that supports science. He says that he tries to find these elements by looking in the, quote, treasure of Christian spiritual experience. Which, if you are somebody looking for treasures of Christian spiritual experience, that's very important. But even for skeptical humanists like myself, I want people looking for these experiences to become ecological activists. So I'm inspired by him looking for that for people who are fed by that spirituality. As a side note, I do want to say Judeo-Christian is a little bit of a problem for me, because anybody who knows the history of science knows the role that Islam had in the development of modern science. Huge. So a little adjustment there. A third area of words of inspiration, rethinking our economic model, which is one of his big projects. I greatly value the section of the encyclical where the Pope reaches beyond the symptoms to the, quote, great causes of our ecological crisis. And he talks about the fact that we trust business and technology so much with our gadgets. And we look to business and technology to solve the problems that it creates. But it can't. That's one of our problems. We're dependent on the problem. And I'll just give you a little bit of a side course, a little side piece here on an example of this that I found so fascinating. Back in the early 70s, when I was young, right around the first Earth Day, there was a couple of famous Keep America Beautiful campaigns. Anybody old enough to remember those might remember the first one saying, "Don't be a litter bug." Right? And then there was a second one featuring Iron Eyes Cody, who was a Native American impersonator actor who became known as the Crying Indian in 1971 for a commercial where he's got a tear rolling down his cheek looking at a whole area of land just covered with litter, plastic and paper. These were extremely effective campaigns, and they all ended with the announcer saying, "People start pollution, people can stop it." That's right. The problem was, the people didn't start that ad campaign, because this is how it shook out. Americans were beginning to get fed up with litter all around. The papers and plastic industry saw this and rushed in to frame the problem. They didn't want Americans to think that our problem is that we pull petrochemicals out of the earth and we cut down trees to make plastic and paper and use it over and over and over and then throw them away. That's not the problem, they said. The problem is people don't dispose of them properly. So they funded that ad campaign, "Don't be a litter bug," so that we would continue to pull resources out of the earth and cut down trees to make paper and plastic products that we throw away after one use. So the problem of trusting business and technology to solve the problems of business and technology does not work. We kept producing because we wanted to make money, because we wanted more, because we wanted easier, because we wanted faster, and we wanted higher profits. So I'm very glad that the Pope criticizes our, quote, culture of excess in chapter 3 of the encyclical. He points out that the overvaluation of power in our culture. We all want to make more and sell more and own more. He pointed to, quote, a tendency to believe that every increase in power means an increase in progress itself, an advance in security, usefulness, welfare, and vigor, an assimilation of new values into the stream of culture, as if reality, goodness, and truth automatically flow from technological and economic power as such. The fact is that contemporary man has not trained to use power very well, because our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. Each age tends to have only a meager awareness of its own limitations. That's lovely. The hard part of writing this was this difficult political balance I'm trying to make. The easy part was this is a well-written piece. I'm going to read a lot of it, by the way. But this hubris of power and wanting and thinking we can do it all is one reason why our economic system breeds violence. He says it, I believe it. We rely on violence in so much in our society, from crime to international affairs, and war hurts the marginalized the most. The poor, women, children, they are the most hurt by war. And it's one reason why many Catholics joined the anti-war movement. From Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers, to the Camden 28 that some of you knew, to the Berrigan brothers, there's a connection between war and social justice. And in the encyclical, the Pope also connects war and environmentalism. He explains that war always does grave harm to the environment and to the cultural riches of people, risks that are magnified when one considers nuclear arms and biological weapons. Despite international agreements which prohibit chemical, bacterial, and biological warfare, the fact is that laboratory research continues to develop new offensive weapons capable of altering the balance of nature. Politics must pay greater attention to foreseeing new conflicts and addressing the causes which lead to them. Sign me up. I'm for that. More words of inspiration. Climate change plus poverty equals refugees. Anybody watching the news knows, right? The Pope goes on to explain that ecological degradation always hits the poor the hardest. Some of us have resources to avoid discomfort. Our air conditioners are on, our showers are warm, our golf courses are green, our pools are full. We're comfortable. But for millions of people who don't even have clean drinking water, they end up suffering from dysentery and cholera daily. And Pope Francis writes, many of the poor live in areas particularly affected by the phenomena related to global warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystem services like agriculture, fishing, and forestry. There has been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. They are not recognized by international conventions as refugees. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protection whatsoever. So whether it's war or drought or flooding, the poor are forced to flee to wherever they can. And this current refugee crisis that I'm going to talk about next month breaks up families, breaks our hearts, but it doesn't break our habits. We keep doing the same thing. We're not changing. It takes a lot of work. It takes the work of, for example, 100 women walking 100 miles. Anybody heard of this campaign? My son Sean signed up last week to be a medic volunteer to walk with 100 women from outside an immigration center in York, Pennsylvania, down to Washington, D.C. They're led by Pilar Molina, and they'll arrive in D.C. in time for a prayer vigil when the Pope is meeting with President Obama. Now, my son is a convinced atheist, but he was inspired by the faith of these women to walk 100 miles to try to reach out to Pope Francis and the President and ask for social justice. More words of inspiration. Love and relationships. As an ethical humanist, I'm very inspired by how the Pope speaks about many of these issues in terms of loving, caring relationships. He speaks about how the environment is not separate from us, but lives in our relationship to nature. We're a part of nature. To emphasize this, he cites his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi. This patron saint of all creatures treats our common home, as he says over and over again, the earth, like a sister or a mother with arms open to embrace us, united in bonds of affection. But modern society, according to the Pope, is too distracted by our technology. He says, quote, this is a wonderful analysis, when media and the digital world become omnipresent, their influence can stop people learning how to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. Real relations with others, with all the challenges they entail, now tend to be replaced by a type of internet communication, thus giving rise to a new type of contrived emotion which has more to do with devices and displays than with other people and with nature. It reminds me of the critique that I spoke about last time, where Felix Adler said we're so distracted by all our stuff and our parties of pleasure that the truly deep, meaningful experiences on life and our connectionship with each other and the planet are eclipsed. This is less the case in South America and in Africa and in some Celtic regions, actually, where the indigenous populations carry forward their culture, which appreciates nature in a much more sacred way. And this is part of the reason why the Pope's ecological message might really take hold in these regions, because they link nature to themselves, their identity, to their ancestors, and to their descendants, more than we do in this country. The Pope emphasizes what he calls justice between the generations. He says, the notion of the common good also extends to future generations. We can no longer speak of sustainable development apart from intergenerational solidarity. And he wraps all these relationships between ourselves and the planet and each other in love. He speaks of civic and political love. Love, quote, overflowing with small gestures of mutual care, a love of macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. And again, citing the conviction of St. Francis of Assisi, the Pope says, emphasizing personal relationships and love is not naive. He says, quote, such a conviction cannot be written off as naive romanticism, for it affects the choices which determine our behavior. If we approach nature and the environment without the openness of awe and wonder, if we no longer speak of the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship to the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then a sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. The poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. As a humanist, I can connect with this. The openness to awe and wonder and relationships and love pulls us personally into our activism. That's one of the powerful aspects of tying our efforts to try to live a better life into the depths of our personality and our relationships with one another. Final words of inspiration I took from the encyclical. Look within. Look within. I'm going to end my talk. I want to talk about the importance of serving the disadvantaged from the inside out. Of building peace from the inside out. Of saving the planet from the inside out. And what I mean by that is that if you don't do work inside yourself, you will not change the world. It's got to be a connection where you look deeply into yourself and see how you can be more effective and true to who you are in a way that changes the world towards the values that you believe in. We have to engage in continual self-examination and personal growth. We can relax and refuel. Of course we can. We need to if we're going to commit to be social justice, environmental, anti-war activists for life. Because we won't last if we don't refuel. But we need to admit that the problems in the world are ones rooted in our own human nature. We all have the capacity for good and evil. You, me, and the Pope. All of us. The Pope says, many things have to change, of course, but if we human beings, above all, who need to change. We lack an awareness of our common origin, our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. The basic awareness would enable the development of a new convictions, attitudes, and forms of life. A great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal. Yet all is not lost, he continues. Human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves and choosing again what is good and making a new start, despite their mental and social conditioning. We are able to take an honest look at ourselves, to acknowledge our deep dissatisfaction, and to embark on new paths to authentic freedom. And of course, all of that self-awareness means nothing if it stays on the inside. So ethical humanism emphasizes deed before creed. We do have a creed. It's a non-theist one that urges us to act to honor the worth of individuals and build social justice. But what matters the most is how we live, how we treat each other. I feel common ground with the Pope. It's the common ground I hope to nurture at this Interfaith Peace Celebration and Dialogue this afternoon. I hope some of you will attend. But what matters most is that we act effectively to minimize suffering, maximize joy, maximize freedom, to build community with compassion and reason. Together, I believe we can end poverty, build peace, and protect the planet. Thank you very much.